think. Okay, over to you.
Right, morning everyone. Just to quickly introduce myself, I'm Mark Brown. I tend to not use doctor too much. I still try and get used to all of that. That's for the professionals. My name is Mark Brown. I'm an independent special needs consultant. I run special help special needs, and what I do is I come into people's homes, work with the individual around a whole range of issues, particularly around anxiety behaviour. And one of the biggest areas I work in is in relation to puberty, sexuality, and all that goes with that. I'm quite passionate about this topic, which you will hopefully discover by the end of the talk. I'm passionate enough because I work with also sex offenders who have got additional needs, most of whom are there because they've not been told the boundaries and that. That I spent 6 years doing a PhD, which was purely autism and sex education, which basically showed that our sex education in schools is rubbish. It's rubbish for mainstream, and it's even worse for individuals that have got some sort of neurodiverse issues as well. Part of that is because a lot of schools, and part of the research I did for my PhD was to actually talk with schools and for once talk with the individuals, talk with the teenagers that were receiving it. And every single one said, you know, it seems as though people are scared to talk about things like penises and vaginas and masturbation and all that sort of thing. And whilst we're being scared to do that, nobody's covering it, and many of the individuals I work with have to fill that gap. And we fill that gap by talking with friends who probably have not got any idea themselves, looking on the internet or all the stuff that we shouldn't be looking at, and just then trying to fill in the blanks. And especially if you've got anybody who likes Netflix, if any of you've seen Bridgerton, that is a sex education class in itself. So, you know, it's very much a case of I'm quite open. I talk a lot about these sorts of things. I've written chapters about masturbation, you know, and sex education. And one of the things I will say to you before we get cracking with this, firstly, from the questions point of view, if we can avoid doing the questions until the end, just because it helps with the flow. And puberty, I could talk for days, let alone an hour and a half. So, you know, there's a lot to talk about. Also, I'm blunt, I'm honest, and I'm open. So it's a case of if you don't like it, hard luck, you're going to have to deal with that on this one. And just to let you know, right at the end, there are some pictures that I use with the individuals I work with that are cartoon pictures. They are explicit. I don't apologise for that. You know, because these are things that you have to use with the individuals. The one thing I would say to you though is, if you've got any kids running around at some point, right near the end, you might not want them to see the pictures. That's one of the difficulties doing this on Zoom. Right, so let me just share the screen. Right, there we are. Okay. Right, so hopefully you should all be able to see that. There we go. So I call this puberty and neurodiversity. Ready or not, here it comes, and there's the epitome of being teenagers from the TV show. The reason why I call it ready or not, here it comes is because hard luck, you're going to have to deal with it. You know, it's something that comes across naturally. You know, we can decide to stop it if we want, but that's going to have an impact. We have a choice. We either deal with it very directly and try and deal with it in a positive way, in a way that means that the individual can feel comfortable about asking questions. We feel comfortable, because one of the things that we don't do is we don't talk enough about sex. It's all very much, oh my God, it's that time to have those conversations. The alternative is to do it indirectly or in a negative way. The difficulty with that, it tends to happen when things have exploded. So what you then find is you're then faced with a situation whereby somebody didn't know what they were doing, and they've broken a rule, they've broken a law, and everybody starts panicking and running around. The difficulty with being reactive with something like this is that it tends to be then you're trying to work out how to resolve the situation as quickly as possible. Whereas actually, if we started talking about it a lot sooner, it would be a lot easier. And it's one of the things I often say about sex education. If we look at it from the point of view of it's not just about sex, it's about relationships, then the new program should have been implemented in September, but of course with COVID, it's all gone a bit awry. Where they're talking about them talking about friendships a lot younger. I entirely agree with. I think that what we should be doing is the moment a child walks into reception, we should start having these lessons. But we're talking about friendships, not relationships, not sex, because often we don't talk enough about friendships. And then when we start talking about relationships, they're going, well, I don't know how to make a friendship, let alone a relationship. When you consider most of the sex education in mainstream schools has often been centered around year 5, where you get to see the DVD of a woman giving birth. And what happens is nobody's had a discussion about how you get to there. You just know that that's where babies come. And then a couple of years later, when they're teenagers, we then start talking about how not to have babies by talking about contraceptives. We still don't have the conversation about how to make friends and how to have decent, healthy relationships. So I think we need to be doing that first and then start talking about things such as sex. And yes, we do need to be talking about those sorts of things way before they're actually legally able to, because otherwise they're going to spend years trying to work these things out, and we need to be proactive with it. Just to also look at a few sort of home truths that some people sort of think, right, okay, and I'm not saying parents, I'm saying professionals as well, the number of professionals who think some really strange ideas. Everybody's going to go through this. It's part and parcel of being a human being. Concerning asking how long is it going to last? How long's a piece of string? Some people, it's a long period of time. Some people, it's short. When does it start? My experience, we're talking roughly about 8-9 years of age, where we start showing signs of the emotional changes and sometimes some physical changes. Know what was cute as a child is not necessarily cute as a teenager or an adult. This is that point where you're having to think to yourself, when a 5-year-old goes up and hugs somebody and everybody goes, oh, that's sweet, that's not going to be appropriate when they're 13, 14, 15, or even if they're an adult. So it's remembering at some point we need to stop, we need to intervene and change things. It can be embarrassing talking about puberty and talking about sex. As you will find out quite quickly with me, I have no embarrassment levels. But for most people, we're like, oh God, do we really need to? But the difficulty is when we're not talking about it, the individual is becoming frustrated because of the fact that they still then don't have somewhere to gain the knowledge. When I was talking about sex offenders, most of the sex offenders I work with are not paedophiles, they're not rapists. They have displayed behaviour that is classed as deviant or law breaking, but that they don't actually understand. I had somebody who unfortunately did have to go into prison. And it was primarily because they went through 2 specialist high schools, and at no point did anybody talk about the age of consent. He didn't know what he was doing was illegal. But if they had told him, he probably wouldn't have done that. So, it's very much a case of it's remembering. Often it's the lack of skills and understanding about the topics. Much of what you're going to be doing concerning as they're developing, especially when it comes to things like hygiene, it's just an extension of what you've already been talking about. The only difference is, let's be honest, teenagers, they've got hormones flying around, they stink. They need to wash a bit more, they need to use deodorants. So it's very much a case of it's teaching them those extra bits and teaching them that you need to be doing it more. One of the things I would say to you, if you've got somebody who takes things very literally, be careful when it comes to deodorant. I had one teenager who the parents were saying to me, he has a shower, he never puts on deodorant. He was saying, I do put on deodorant. I turned around to him and I said, okay, show me how you put on deodorant. Now, I don't know whether you'll be able to see this on the camera, but he went, well, I do this. And the reason he sprayed it was because he'd been told, you spray it under your arm. Nobody had said you spray it on your armpit. So once we talked about that, fine, okay. When it comes to knowing what you need to be thinking about, find out what is being taught at school. Now, that's going to be very varied. I mean, when I did my research, it was very much a case of some schools, they did did it for a long period of time. Other schools, they did little bits. Some schools would pick on topics because something had happened, that knee-jerk reaction. So find out what's being taught, but also look at yourself and go, right, okay, do I know everything? How embarrassed am I going to be when we start talking about penises and vaginas and all that sort of thing? Because you need to put your embarrassment to one side. You need to make sure you've got all the knowledge that you can. And think about what it would have been like if, for example, when you were younger, you didn't have sex education. Saying that, my sex education was pretty rank when I was a child. It was just more about tittering in the back row because we were talking about condoms and all those sorts of things. So, you know, to be quite honest, it's not improved that much. So these are just things to remember, that actually, even though you've got a child who's got neurodiverse issues, and in a sense, it doesn't matter whether you've got a child who's 7, 8, 9, whether you've got a teenager. A lot of the stuff we're going to talk about will cover all of that, but you still do need to know these things. So what I'm going to do is we're going to whiz through looking at changes. Now, the thing I'm not going to do is I'm not going to talk about all the changes. We all know and been there, done that, got the t-shirt about what happens to our bodies. However, there's a few specific areas that we need to be thinking about. So when it comes to the physical side, research has shown that 1/3 of autistic teenagers will experience some sort of epileptic seizure during puberty, even if they've never had it before. Often it will last for the whole of puberty and then stop. If you've got somebody who has epilepsy anyway, it may increase the epilepsy. Now, it's an important piece of research because there are many professionals out there that have gone, it doesn't, you know, it's nothing to do with puberty, but actually it was shown that 33%. And in fact, actually, I recently double checked, and I believe it is now between something like 30 and 40% of teenagers. So it's getting higher while people recognise it. The other issue with puberty from a physical point of view, boundaries and how things are going to change. There are no clear boundaries. You can't turn around to your child and say, right, okay, at this point you're going to get hair underneath your arms, you're going to get it around your penis, your vagina, all those sorts of things. You can't, which causes problems if you've got somebody who likes structure. If you've got somebody who finds it difficult to plan ahead, what I would often say to parents is get yourself an information pack together. So let's think about menstruation, for example. If you've got a daughter who, if you start talking about it way before they showed signs, they would freak out, be worried about it all the time. What I would do is I'd go on the internet, I'd search. And the reason I say about getting it together is because there is so much information on the internet, tons of stuff that you can use. But the difficulty is if you're in panic mode, you've got to make sure you adapt it. So by thinking to yourself, right, okay, before she's actually starting to menstruate, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a pack together. I'm going to adapt the materials for her. The moment she starts showing signs of spotting, right, out comes the pack. We're ready. There's no panic. You've got it all sorted out for them, and you can start talking to them about it as things are happening. That way reduces some of the stress that's going on. When it comes to the sexual side, in this day and age, trying to decide and trying to work out what is normal sexual behavior is really difficult. You know, if you think about when I was younger, the only way you access things like pornography was if you had somebody tall enough to reach the top shelf of the newsagents, or you found your brother or sister's stash hidden away somewhere. Nowadays, go online, you can do it on your phone, you can do it on your computer, you can find all manner of stuff. A couple of things that I always forewarn parents about: if you've got somebody who likes YouTube, be cautious, because if they put in U and then the letter P, they will potentially be directed to youporn.com, which basically is exactly the same as YouTube, but it is just complete porn clips, anything from a few seconds to an hour long. It covers everything that is completely legal: threesomes, anal, oral, the whole works. And there is no screen that you click to say, are you over 18? As if any self-respecting 16-year-old is going to click, no, I'm under 18. Also be wary, some of the security systems we have on our computers will not recognize certain sites because they're coded in that way, so that you will end up being directed to those sorts of things. The difficulties well with many of these is the fact that they're often done within some sort of framework of a story. So, for example, I was doing sex education group with a specialist school, and one of the lads put his hand up and said, "Mark, I want to be a taxi driver." Now, all the staff were sort of looking, going, "Why is he mentioning that?" I knew what he was talking about because there is a site called faketaxi.com, which is a porn site. And those of us that are in Surrey, especially the what would be classed, I think, as the southeast of Surrey, we have the honour of that's where it's filmed. Basically, what happens is this man, pretends to be a taxi driver, goes around the streets picking up gorgeous young ladies and coercing them into having sex. Of course, it's all fake. This lad thought it was completely true. And so he started thinking, well, that's how I must start a relationship, how I must be able to do those sorts of things. And so we then had to have conversations around those sorts of aspects. So it's important that we recognize that, because whether it's to do with the sexual behavior, whether it's to do with things like masturbation, it is very much a case of having to be aware of how difficult it is these days to put two and two together and work it all out. Plus, you have to remember it is so easy to access, and just be cautious with your child's phone or tablet if they connect to a Wi-Fi, because you might have adult content blockers concerning using your data, but there are some areas where if you connect up to the Wi-Fi and do internet search through the Wi-Fi, actually it goes around it, bypasses those security systems. So be very, very wary of what is actually happening, and be aware of what they're looking at. Then, of course, there's issues around flirting and building relationships, looking at mutual and consenting sexual behaviours. And with this, it's very much a case of it's also knowing that there's two actual ages of consent. For a physical side, if you're face to face, it's 16, as long as you're both consenting and it's in private. However, if you're then looking at the online world, you're then having to think to yourself, it's 18. So all those teenagers that are sexting each other, sending pictures and dirty conversations that are under 18, they are actually breaking the law technically. So we have to remember all of those sorts of aspects. Then we've got the cognitive side, going from concrete way of thinking to more abstract. I tend to equate this to going from primary school to high school. In primary school, you can have these, you can behave in a slightly different way to everybody else. But when you hit high school, if you start acting differently, or you're not too sure about how to make friendships and relationships, it can cause many difficulties. Also, when it comes to the cognitive side, 10% of autistic people have been shown to have marked deterioration in their mental state during adolescence. They never really gave a reason why, but in my experience, what you tend to find is when somebody hits teenagers, and it's not actually just somebody who's autistic, it's somebody with any neurodiversity. When you hit teenagers, there's so many things that you've got to work out and all these changes going on that sometimes you just want to retreat. You want to isolate yourself. You want to engage in things like obsessions and wanting structure. So you seem as though actually you're deteriorating. No, you're not. What's actually happening is you're protecting yourself. You're surrounding yourself with that shield away from all the changes that are going on, because the support isn't necessarily there. When it comes to the social side of being a teenager, well, this is when you've got to start exploring yourself. You've got to start thinking about who you are, what your identity is. And often within that search, some people will find it difficult, so their self-esteem will hit rock bottom. You also tend to find that you're picking on other people's identities, especially if they're strong identities. One area that is extremely interesting is the issue of sexuality, and especially things like transgenderism. And I must admit, I'm doing a lot of work around this at the moment concerning supporting individuals to explore their sexuality to try and gain an understanding. And it's important that we do have these discussions, because the services that are out there, for example, just looking at the transgender side, there's been very little research that looks at people that have got neurodiverse issues and how that might relate to somebody who's got wants to transition to the opposite gender. And in fact, the pieces of research that have been found have looked and gone, well, actually, we realise we can't provide the support that that individual needs. And a lot of it is about the thought process. You know, for some people, and I've supported some that have transitioned successfully, and I've supported some that have wanted to transition, and then through discussion, through trying to explore how they feel about themselves and what's going on, they've actually then gone, no, it's not a transition I want to do. It's, you know, I actually feel attracted to the same sex. Fine, okay, let's work and talk through all those sorts of bits and pieces. So it's important that we have open discussions, because of the fact that if we don't, these things are going to go underground and things start happening. So when it comes to the social side, we're also having to develop new skills, new understandings, looking at what's going on around us, and it's trying to get those experiences and those understandings. One of the difficulties you also tend to find is the fact of we're moving from being with the family into peer groups. Now, in a sense, teenagers are stuck in this ongoing war, because one minute they want complete independence. They don't want mum and dad around. And this, it doesn't mean, not just somebody who's neurodiverse, it's any teenager. So they don't want mum and dad around, but then suddenly they need mum and dad. And it's being stuck in that. I mean, I've got a 20-year-old who's at university doing paramedic training. And I always remember the first time when she left, it was like, yep, I'm fine, I can do this. Every time the phone went, it would be dad. You know, and she's better now, mostly because I keep saying to her, would you just phone me when you want to talk, not just ask me a favour. But it's still the same. It's the same for all of them. They want that independence, but they still want mum and dad around. They still want to have that link. Of course, when we're looking at physical side, there's a few specific areas that I often get asked about. And one of those, if any of you have got young girls, is menstruation. You know, quite often if I work with a young lady and they haven't started menstruating, sometimes the first thing that is asked is, what do we do about menstruation? Well, to be quite honest, it's having those conversations in the same way that anybody would be having a conversation with a teenage girl. No, it's going to be embarrassing, but it's important to be able to, it's important for them to know that everybody else is going through exactly the same sort of things, and preparing for it in advance is actually going to be a good thing. There's quite a few books. There is a book by Robin Stewart, who's a lady with autism, who talks about menstruation from the point of view of things like sensory, all those sorts of bits and pieces, and, you know, structure, and sort of provides some input concerning it. But the biggest areas to think about is having appropriate information and material, so you've got everything there. It's also thinking about how you're going to teach this and what you're going to teach them to use. So, for example, I tend to say sanitary towels, because apart from anything else, with tampons, for example, you're talking about not just telling them how to insert it. You've got to remember that they need to remove it. I've had a few that have become ill because of the fact that nobody taught them that you had to remove it. It was just thought, well, that's common sense. But they took things very literally. Also, the trouble with tampons as well, if you've got somebody who doesn't particularly like getting dirty, has motor skill issues, it can cause problems. With sanitary towels, you can now get menstruation pants or menstruation knickers, which have got little pouches in them where you can preload the sanitary towel. All your daughter then needs to do is just take one set of knickers off and put another one on. You know, it makes life a hell of a lot easier, and especially thinking about how much assistance they probably aren't going to get when they're at school. When you want to talk about it, think about how and when is it best to talk about it. Now, that might be dictated by your daughter. You know, they might suddenly say at the dining room table, I want to talk about menstruation. Okay, as long as everybody's stomachs can cope with it, then have that conversation. And think about whether or not you need to be looking at some visuals. Now, the ones I've used, and these are all can be adapted, and you can get these online. This one, I used this one with somebody who was actually non-verbal, had a range of issues, and one of her biggest things was the fact that when she bled, she always wanted to go to A&E. So if she cut a finger, A&E. If we didn't talk her through having a period, they would be spending 1 week out of every month constantly being in A&E. So what we did was we did adapt it. We said, once I was a baby, then I was a little girl. Now I'm a big girl, and later I'll be a woman. What we then said was we kept out all the details about the menstrual cycle. What we did say was once a month she would bleed from her vagina, and we basically said that was fine. And we also talked about pain. We did highlight you might feel pain. And then what we did was we talked about what she needed to do. And we just kept on and kept on with this. From the moment she was one that you couldn't plan ahead. So from the moment she started spotting, right, we implemented this. Touch wood, she quite quickly got the hang of it. And they didn't end up at A&E for 1 week out of every month. She actually coped with it remarkably well. The only thing we had was occasional changes on behaviour, which would have been to do with, we could only guess because she couldn't really tell us, pain, or potentially, she might have had PMT, which I know quite a few people I've worked with might have. But it was very much a case of at least she knew what to expect. Now, as I said, there's loads of these sort of things out there, and it's just a case of finding it or even just adapting it yourself. Then from the boys' point of view, we have erections and wet dreams, which is always a lovely topic of conversation when you want to put the frighteners onto somebody. And it's important there again that we talk about these sorts of things, because the amount of individuals I know from an erection point of view that suddenly start panicking because they're getting erections at the drop of a hat. I've had a few that have turned around to me and said, well, I was watching TV and suddenly this picture came up, I had an erection. Does that mean I'm some sort of deviant? And you're like, well, hold on a second, what was your hand doing? Oh, well, my hand was, yeah, there you go. Your hand was hovering around, so you probably touched it. And, plus with the hormones anyway, it can just happen. And it's important they know. I've had a few individuals over the years that have often come running up to me and saying, my penis is broken, it suddenly keeps going hard, and is this the right thing? Is that the right thing? Fine. They just, they need to understand. And when it comes to things like body parts for both girls and boys, name them properly, because there are still, it's amazing how many teenagers I know that do not know what their body parts are. I'm due to actually do a whole load of sex education concerning physical development with some year 5, 6, and 7s in the next couple of weeks. They will know what their penis is. They will also be able to tell me what they call it, because then at least we can marry that together and they can understand when somebody says about penis, that they actually know. The other thing that is really important is the issue of wet dreams. Now, very few schools I know actually talk about wet dreams. And if you've got somebody who's been dry and then suddenly they start having wet dreams, it can seem as though they're starting to wet themselves, which is embarrassing enough. And I had one young man who I'd known on and off for years and I hadn't seen for a while. His mum phoned me and said, we've got a problem. And he used to wet the bed, but that was all sorted. She said, I think he's having a wet dream. But he's starting to find it really difficult. Can you have a talk with him? Fine, okay, that's no problems. So I came in and I sat with him and I said, okay, so wet dreams you've talked about in the school. And he must have been about 13 at the time. He was in a mainstream secondary school. And he said, what do you mean, wet dreams? I've never, no. So we talked about it. We had to talk about it. We had to explore what a wet dream was, because he was so panicked because it was like, oh my God, I'm wet in the bed. Why am I wet in the bed? He was feeling guilty about it all. All we had to do was just talk through it all and work out with him a plan of action concerning what to do. You know, these are simple things that we need to be looking at, but we don't. We just look at all the other bits and pieces and we try to sweep it under the carpet. And we're then left with somebody who's got to deal with these on their own because they're not sure about who to ask. From there, and it is a bit of a whirlwind, from there we go to the social side of life. Now, social side of life is bad enough for anybody who's got neurodiverse issues. When we hit teenage years, all hell breaks loose because we have all manner of different things that come along. You know, concerning social skills, if the stuff that we're doing when they're younger, there again, it's just building upon those sorts of things. It's giving them the understanding and letting them explore it that much more, and to look and go, right, okay, what do we now need to be thinking of? You know, one of the difficulties that I often find is when somebody goes from primary school to high school, you know, often in that first 6 months, things start to go a bit wrong of year 7. And a lot of it is because of the social side. Because if they haven't got the social skills to start marrying up with friendships and everything else, then it's going to cause them stress and it's going to cause them difficulties. We need to be able to give them the chance to have those experiences and those messages in a controlled and safe fashion so they can develop their skills. You know, and it's recognizing that they will still, regardless of what we may teach them, they will still be, you know, there will still be a difference between them and their peers that may be neurotypical. And it's just getting that balance right. It's getting that balance concerning, you know, what sort of things they're more concerned about. We also need to be thinking that when we're looking and going, right, okay, we need to develop that person's social skills. We need to help them. How sometimes, yeah, we can support them, but actually we can also have a really bad impact upon them. For example, I worked with somebody where everybody's saying he needs to learn social skills. He went to a school where it was a mainstream school. He went to the school where if he walked into the classroom and he did not say good morning to the teacher, that teacher would point them out in front of everybody and go, "What do you say?" They were so scared about socializing. When it was lunchtime, they had one chair and table they would sit at, which was hidden away. If somebody was sat in there, they would grab their lunch, throw it away and not eat. First time I met him, I walked into his house. His parents were saying to me, you know, we've got to look at this, and you need to know this. I walked in and he was playing on Minecraft. And this is a few years ago before they modernized Minecraft a bit more. He was having conversation, completely appropriate conversation over the internet. Reason being, no eye contact. If he didn't know what to say, he wouldn't necessarily answer. And it is something we need to remember that, you know, with the online world, it is a right more pain in the backside trying to get them off of it. However, sometimes it is the best social arena for them to be in. We just need to get that balance. So I turned around to him and everybody was thought, we need to put together these programs, do this now. And I turned around to him and said, have you ever gone down the road to buy yourself a bar of chocolate? And he went, no, I can't do that. I've got to talk to the person behind the counter. I said, okay, you want to go into university. How the hell are you going to survive? Because you need to do shopping. You're going to be living in the accommodation. You're going to need to be doing groups, and you hate groups. So how are you going to cope with that? So what we then did was we didn't talk about social skills for everything. We talked about social skills for him to live. He was never going to be a party animal. You know, he had sensory processing issues. If you threw him into a party, he'd be underneath the table or running out the other door. So why even bother about turning them into sociable animals like that? We need to enable them to live. Now, don't get me wrong, there are some people that will be party animals. I've had a few that I've seen on Facebook, and I really wish they wouldn't be party animals because, you know, they really have some difficulties that side of it. But with him, what we did was we then started working on all those bits for him to live. So he went to university because considering he had neurodiverse issues, he was an extremely bright young man. He went to university. He got round to shopping. He did cheat a little bit. He ordered it all online, but he still had to talk to the person. He was in his dorm. He knew if he put his head out of his bedroom and somebody walked past you, said good morning, and if he was in the kitchen cooking or somebody was there, he would have to have a conversation. He did the group work. The difference was when everybody else was doing Freshers' Weeks and partying, he was doing his version of Freshers' Week. He took his gaming console up with him, and his Freshers' Week, he was playing Minecraft online with all his mates. Just because he wasn't going out partying doesn't mean that he wasn't enjoying himself. And I think we do have to be very aware that we have this image in our head concerning how sociable somebody needs to be. Actually, no. We need them to be able to understand whatever ability level they're at, whether they're somebody who is verbal, non-verbal, whatever, they need to have the social skills that they require, not what we think they need. You know, we need to be working our way around those sorts of things. So how do we develop it? Well, to be quite honest, we put a lot of stuff concerning social, the social side of life, and you know, it's very much a case of with the social side. Often, social independence is not just about interacting with people; it's doing things for themselves. You know, it's helping to make their own lunch or drinks, keeping their room tidy. Although, if anybody's got any ideas concerning a teenager, then you know, please write it all down, because I think there's plenty of parents that could do with a teenager who knows how to tidy their bedroom. Things like personal hygiene, and with a lot of these, it's not just. I'm not just talking about somebody who's going to potentially go off and go to university. If you've got somebody who's always going to need support, it's about thinking of the long-term aspects. You know, it's thinking about how can we help this individual be as independent as possible. And I know within the EHCP paperwork, there's an aspect concerning aspirations of the parents. And I often say to parents, you know, yes, go for the independence, but it's as independent as they can be. So I've got somebody, for example, who is non-verbal, severe learning disabilities, had a whole range of stuff. On his EHCP, as part of his as independent as possible, is for him to take himself off to the toilet on his own. That's it. He's always going to need support. But wouldn't it be nice if we can get them a little bit more independent, even down to the next one, privacy? You know, knowing that if you were living with other people, you don't walk downstairs butt naked, because that's not private. And on the subject of private, when we talk about private, you know, it's remembering that people using things like FaceTime, Skype, Zoom, all of those sorts of things on their devices. And I know I'm going to talk about masturbation later, but one of the things I always talk about is when we talk about privacy in the bedroom, yes, curtains closed, door shut. But also, if you're laying there butt naked and you're talking to a mate on FaceTime, that is not private, because they can see into your room. And the amount of people I know that have not had that discussed with them because, hey, the door's shut, the curtain's closed, it's private. No, it's not. And they've gotten into trouble. So we do have to nowadays go beyond what we were thinking, what we've always thought about. And when it comes to the social interactions, it's remembering that there's often difficulties concerning understanding a range of aspects, important parts of social interactions, social cues, conversational skills, looking at what's going on. And it's remembering that often when we're in a social situation, we're thinking lots of different things all at the same time. You know, we're trying to pick up on different bits that are going on around us, and all manner of different bits and pieces. However, if you've got somebody whose processing is hindered by sensory processing, they've got slower processing, communication issues, being able to assess a social situation is horrendous. You know, it's no wonder that there are so many people that decide that they want to remove themselves from society, because it's far easier, it's not so overloaded. We've also got to start thinking about emotion. always what kicks me is the amount of individuals that I've worked with where there's been issues concerning how they've reacted to a situation, and professionals go, well, they should understand it and recognize the emotions in that person. Hold on a second. Most of the ones I work with can't even understand their own emotions, let alone somebody else's. When I work with emotions, we talk about four. We talk about happy, sad, angry, worried. That's all we ever talk about. We don't talk about anything complex, and we pull it apart until that person understands it from their point of view. Then we start talking about the rest of it. Difficulty with all of this, what it means is if they haven't got those skills and they haven't had the support, it's all about how to make friendships and relationships, how to make sure you're with the right person, what their intentions are, what are friends for, keeping it going. Most of the ones I work with, they've got limited social skills, won't know how to keep a friendship moving beyond a week, because it's like we'll throw everything into it and then something happens and all hell breaks loose. So, you know, it's remembering you've got all of these, plus linked with that is the fact of risk and vulnerability, because somebody whose social skills, social developments are lacking, they're going to be also up for so many different aspects of being vulnerable. So firstly, from their point of view, not understanding when they're with somebody, what is that person intending for me to do? You know, that's a prime example of, you know, if you give me a fiver, I'll be your friend for life. Well, actually, that's not how we make friends. That's how we bribe the hell out of someone. Things like appropriate boundaries, knowing when we should and shouldn't stop. Being able to learn from what's happened. The amount of individuals I work with where something will go wrong and everybody goes, well, they should learn from that. But often they don't. They put it into a box in their head and they go, yes, I'll remember that next time. But in the situation, impulsivity kicks in and goes, well, okay, all of that stuff that you've talked about before, we're not going to remember that. We're just going to get on with it. Lack of guidance, the fact that we do not guide properly. You know, social skills training, for example, social skills groups. There are some social skills groups, it is so rigid in their instruction. You know, I know of some social skills groups that prior to lockdown and the pandemic have basically screwed up somebody's life, because we talk about when you meet somebody, shake the hand and say hello. Well, if you haven't taught anything else, how the hell is that person surviving during COVID? Because the last thing we should be doing is shaking hands. You know, it's quite interesting. I've got quite a few people that used to do that before COVID, and I've gone to go and do some work with them. Now you get the elbow. So they're now learning, they've been taught how that. One of the best ways of teaching, of learning social skills is informally. The best social skills group I've ever seen was, if anybody knows Warhammer, which are the little figures that you paint and you take to the gaming workshops, there's a couple in Surrey, I know. You take and you have a battle in the middle of the shop with other people. Those sorts of things are really good, because what you've got is you've got something for them to focus on. They can talk to the nth degree concerning the figures, and it doesn't matter because everybody else is doing it. But then what it does is it gives them confidence to build up. And it's really interesting. I've got one near me in Sutton. And I remember once walking past there one Sunday afternoon, way many years ago. And I looked and there was 50% of them I knew in there. And 50% of them had atrocious social skills. They wouldn't say anything to anyone. They were laughing. They were talking with each other. They were actually hugging each other. And it was like, wow. But it was because they had that common interest. It's a bit like Lego clubs as well. They're quite good. If you go to a Comic-Con, there's plenty of neurodiverse people that dress up in various outfits to meet other people, and it's just a place where they gain that confidence. And also issues around social and emotional cues, recognizing those sorts of things. The difficulty is, that's about the individual themselves, but also it's about everybody else and how everybody else is vulnerable. Because if you're faced with somebody who has no understanding about feelings and the needs of other people, or the consequences, then potentially you're going to be faced with somebody who will do something, not maliciously, but they will do it because they think it's the right thing, like coming up to you and trying to give you a hug, and you don't actually know the person. But then that puts you all in a very, very difficult situation. So it's remembering that it's not just about the individual, it's about everybody else. And as I said, I'm not demonizing the individual. I'm just saying, if we're not teaching the right social skills, the right interaction skills, the right consequences, then how the heck are they going to know what they're doing to the other person is incorrect? You know, it's a bit like going back to relationships and the sexual relationships, etc. Without knowing how to make friends, how are they going to make proper sexual relationships? How are they going to know what consent is? All of those bits will help them understand the feelings and needs of others and the consequences of their actions. Now, one area that I always talk about, any of my puberty talks, and it's always interesting because most of the time I'm talking to mums or female members of staff. Very rarely do I ever have large groups of dads, and it's an interesting area. Is the men's toilets, because there's a whole set of rules that we go by that when we're in the men's toilets that nobody ever talks about. And when you consider your child, your son, for most of the time when they're at school, will probably be with females. If they're going to respite, probably a high proportion of females. Any social clubs, probably high proportion of females. They will be surrounded by lots of females. And, you know, we're trying to encourage independence by them being able to use the men's toilets. Now, if I was in a room with all of you and I went to you, right, okay, what is the thing that you worry about most about your teenage son going into the men's toilets on their own? Quite often it will be, well, all of those dirty old men that are in there that are going to hurt them. Actually, that's second. The first thing you should be worried about is your own child who does not understand the urinal etiquette. And if we don't talk about this, no school talks about this. My dad, when I was younger, didn't put his arm around me and say, Mark, now's the time to learn it. We just learn these things. And they're quite simple. So, for example, pairs. We do not go to the toilet in pairs. You ladies love going to the toilet in pairs. If I was out with my mates, you know, and I said to them, I'm going to go for a wee, do you want to come to the toilet with me? They will laugh because they know what I do, and then they'll tell me where to go. But you ladies, you're often going to the toilet with your friends. When you're in the toilets, men, we go in there, we do our business, and we leave. No talking, no fuss. You ladies, you go in there, you talk, you adjust your underwear, you do your makeup, you take selfies, you do all manner of things. We go in, and the only time we do talk usually is at places like pubs or special events, and usually it's because somebody's had too much to drink, and there's always that person that wants to chat a lot. Looking, we look either straight ahead, up or down. We do not look either side, because that can be misinterpreted as something more sexual. And actually, if you're lucky with the urinals, what you have is we have walls, and you know, to actually glance and do anything, you have to actually physically do it. However, it's remembering that there are a lot of shopping centres where you now have a trough, so there are no sides. So it's quite easy for glances to occur. Touching, and I don't mean anything sexual, I mean literally, you know, if you're stood at a urinal and it's remembering, I don't know if you can see behind me, I've got two metal strips here. This is roughly slightly smaller than a urinal where we would stand. So we're often like this. If you're like that and somebody comes along, you have to move. You are literally constantly like that. So there's no touching. And then trousers. Trousers are always up. You know, there's no showing your backside when you stood at the urinals. All those lads that walk up and down the high streets with the trousers halfway around their backsides, if they only knew what it meant in the prisons. The difficulty is, we then have another set of rules when we're sat in the cubicles, because with the cubicles you can get away with a pair because you might have somebody holding on to the door. I mean, interestingly, concerning the pairs bit, one of the things I've got to mention is, I know, having done this so many times, there are nightclubs in London that actually have two toilets in one cubicle, so you ladies can sit and wee and poo together, which is a real bizarre thing. Talking when you're sat in a cubicle, you can get away with that to a point. Looking doesn't matter because you're in a cubicle. Touching doesn't matter, you're in a cubicle. Trousers have to be down anyway. You know, and it's important that we know these sorts of things, because if you've got somebody who doesn't know these and break some of these, and you have got somebody who wants to do harm, then actually it gives them a bit of a red light and telling you, right, okay, this is what we can do. The other thing we also do is, and you know, some people think we must get up to so much in the toilets. We play a game called urinal bingo. So what we do is we walk into the toilets, and we will assess where people are standing, and then decide where we're going to stand. Now, if it was the top one, we'd probably be down this end. If it's the middle one, these are probably friends or maybe desperate for a wee, would be down this one. This one here, this is the sort of thing you'd find at an amusement park, concerning it being so busy. At this point, you would find a queue of men, I do not jest, who all want to have a wee, who are so desperate not to stand in that one there that they will be in a queue to wait to go into a cubicle. And interestingly, all of this aspect, now it sounds a bit of fun, but if you look and go from Legoland to Chesington to Fort Park, not going to hang around the men's toilets, I hasten to add, you can see how in Legoland, the kids are going in with their dads and they go, oh yeah, dad, dad, dad. You can hear the dads go, shh, we'll talk when we get outside. By the time they get to Fort Park, you're in, you're out. All the teenagers are invariably, unless they're overexcited, they will run in and do what they've got to do and get out again. And you can see how it progresses. Compare that to the ladies, and you know, I've stood outside waiting for my partner, and you can hear women talking as they're coming. No, with the men, it's straight out. These are important aspects because it does increase the vulnerability of an individual. And you know, there again, it's part of that independence thing. We're trying to encourage them to be able to use the public toilets so they can have that independence for later on. Other areas of risk and vulnerability we need to be thinking about are things such as looking at issues around relationships, how to build them, and what you can do with different people. Now, to demonstrate how I would do that, I tend to use this. So what you have is, I would be saying to the individual, well, group or whatever, right, let's think about all the people you have a relationship with: mum, dad, brother, sister, you know, teacher, taxi driver, all those sorts of bits and pieces. I also throw in police, doctor, and nurse, and I'll explain why in a minute. Then what we do is we put them, you know, in, you know, the closer they are, the closer they go into the middle of the circle. Then what we do is we have a list. We have a list that starts with say hello to, shake hands, give a hug, kiss on the cheek, kiss on the lips, and we keep it going until we've got, you know, being naked in front of, touching private parts, having sex, depending on the age of the individual. You know, we would talk about that. And what we do is we go through every single person that's on that circle of relationship and go, right, okay, what would you do with each one? Yes, it does open up discussion, because, for example, when you start talking about brothers and sisters, you start talking about, you know, would you hug them? There are some people who go, no, I wouldn't hug them. I will then go, fine, you wouldn't hug them, but is it okay to hug them if you both wanted to? No, is it against the law? No, it's not. We then look at police, doctor, and nurse. And the reason why we do that is because one of the biggest issues we tend to say to individuals is not to talk to strangers, don't let strangers touch private parts. However, what happens if they are faced with injuring their private parts, and they need to be checked out by a doctor or a nurse? They're not going to know every single doctor and nurse that's around. So what's then going to happen is you're then turning around going, after all these years of me telling you what you shouldn't do, I'm now going to break that rule. So what we do is we then tend to start talking about, okay, if you're in that position, you're going to have to be checked out by a doctor or nurse physically. You can have mum or dad there or somebody else there. But we also then talk about, well, if you went in with just a cough, would you necessarily need to let them touch your penis or vagina? No, you wouldn't. When it comes to the police, it's that talking to concerning if that person comes up to you, you might not know that police officer, but if they said to you, you know, can I have a word with you? You need to have that conversation. You need to know that you are able to have that conversation, and you should. So it's just making sure that it's all clarified and is a lot clearer. Going back to this, thinking about what is a stranger and a friend. Saying no and being assertive. Now, this is an interesting one because often when I go into schools, they will turn around to me and say, right, okay, you know, we've split it off into groups. That group over there, they're going to need to know everything. That group over there, they're always going to be cared for by somebody. So actually, they don't need to know much. I always then turn around and say, yes, they do. You know, because I think even if legally they would not be allowed to have a sexual relationship with anybody, isn't it their right to understand the word no and to understand what is good touch and bad touch, especially if they're going to be somebody who's going to need some sort of physical care? You know, so I will always say to schools, we will teach them up to and including things such as being able to say no if you feel that somebody is touching you in an inappropriate way. We also look at things such as public and private. We talk about public and private body parts, including non-sexual ones. So you might have somebody who, for sexual reasons, might not like their arms being touched. So we highlight that as an issue. We also talk about the public and private locations. We talk about, you know, things like curtains, clothes, all those sorts of bits and pieces. But we cover everything. We explore it as much as possible. Even if, for example, when I've talked about cars, you know, is a car a private place or a public place? If you parked it in the wood, is it public or private? And people say, well, it's private because no one's there. Well, no, it's not. It's public because how can we guarantee that nobody's going to go past that? You know, and they've got the windows and they can look in. So it's not just taking any of this at face value. It's really putting it apart and trying to put it into perspective so that they fully understand and they have the chance to explore it. And I mean, one of the things I tend to do as well is I tend to not take yes as an answer. It's okay, if you understand this, tell me, how does it work? When we look at things like consent, we look at public and private, all those sorts of things, we use scenarios because it enables the individual to start processing stuff. Then from there, looking at things like relationships. You know, one of the things we do need to be very aware of is how easy it is for somebody to become infatuated with somebody else and do things that they feel is appropriate or somebody said to them it's appropriate. However, it becomes more stalkish than anything else. And that puts them into a position where they can actually come across the criminal justice system. They can have exclusions from school. They can be all manner of different aspects that can come from somebody doing something. And when I'm talking about stalking, I'm talking about, for example, texting somebody at the dead of night, and instead of sort of texting one message, texting, harassing them because they don't know the boundaries. As I've already said, we need to look at friendship skills. We need to understand how to make those sorts of interactions before we do anything about anything more intimate, because of the fact that, you know, if we jump straight to the more intimate stuff without the basics, it's going to fail. And talking about these sorts of things, it's not, there was a time when they used to say, well, if we teach people who've got neurodiverse issues, if we teach them about sex, they're all going to go off and have sex. Well, actually, no. What it does do, it means that they can understand what's going on around, and it can, if it's taught right, if it's taught openly, not prescriptive, and taught in a way that encourages the conversation, then actually it should enable them to be able to develop healthy and happy sexual relationships later on when it's appropriate. So to help with that, just a few minor strategies on that. You know, develop some rules concerning relationships and friendships. You know, that's going to help concerning crushes and, you know, those things such as texting somebody at the dead of night. Make sure they understand and they've had input, whether it's from yourself, whether it's from school or somebody else, concerning aspects of relationships, things like timescales, ages, you know, when they can have sexual relationships. What is a relationship? Not just a sexual relationship, but a boyfriend, girlfriend, boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever relationship. Because they need to understand. I mean, the amount of people I know that have never even been taught about what sex is, and they've kissed somebody and gone, "Oh my God, I've just had sex, I'm going to get pregnant." You know, I still have people that say those sorts of things, and it's amazing how in this day and age that is still somebody's perspective. But that's because we've not done the right sort of education. Think about issues concerning consent and permission. You know, trying to work out with them, how do you gain that consent? If you want some prompts for consent, one of the best videos that I use for consent is consent as a cup of tea as consent. You can get it off of YouTube. It's a cartoon one. Be cautious because there's about 3 versions. One of them's the English one, which I don't like. It's very prim and proper. One's an American one, which is a bit. They all say the same thing, but it's just the tone. And then there is a swearing version of the American one, which, yeah, you just have to be cautious as to which one. You need the clean American one, I tend to find. And with that, it talks about consent and sex like a cup of tea. Now, yes, that is an abstract idea, but what you do is, as long as you are setting the scene concerning when they're talking about a cup of tea, it is sex, then it does help. And I have quite a few. I remember teaching a group of year 6s, all of whom had neurodiverse issues. And by the end of our 6 sessions together, I'd walk in and immediately they would tell me, like, this is what consent is, Mark. This is what I have to do. Da, 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 da. And we weren't talking about sex. We were talking about touching. It did get a bit much when they made me a lovely card. Nearly all of them said, "We now know about consent. Consent means I had this long list of what consent was." But no, it was good because at least they knew. Things concerning feelings and recognizing their own feelings, and also the feelings of any partners they may have, and how things change within all of that. Of course, with all of this, you know, we're putting in these rules. Also, what we need to do is we need to give them the opportunity and encouragement to actually use some of the skills that we're teaching them. You know, that's often a frustrating thing for me concerning when I've worked with people, and there's been somebody that said, "Oh yeah, that's fine, but they still can't go out and try out these skills." Well, you know, why on earth am I teaching them? I did have that with a social worker. I promptly just said, "Well, you can tell him," and left her to it. I don't think she had the guts to do it. But so it's just remembering some of these aspects that need to be taught so that they can have these healthy relationships, and they can build upon their abilities. Now, and as I said, this is quite a whirlwind. We're just going to quickly touch on anxiety and anger. Now, anxiety and anger I tend to talk about in a completely separate talk. However, there's just a few bits to remember concerning the teenage years. With the teenage years, there's a slight added bit to it. You know, it's not just the same as it always has been, because there's other bits to put into it. So often with things like anxiety and anger, you've got behavior changes, remembering that we have got hormones flying around, so there will be some behavior changes. Also, at the same time, it's thinking about and recognizing that some of the behavior changes may be because they're with other teenagers. So this part of it is the difficult bit, because you've got to try and work out which is then being a snotty teenager and which is actually an anxiety anger issue. Increased or new obsessions. You know, and one of the things I always talk about when I did an obsession talk the other day is the fact that we don't get rid of obsessions, we get control of them, because an obsession is there to help the person relax. They need it to understand what's going on, but it's a case of we just need to get some controls over it. Sometimes regression in skills, especially self-help skills. You know, and sometimes that can be because they're feeling overwhelmed by the relationship side, that, you know, it's just too much for them to actually worry about themselves. And then, of course, attitude and approach towards others. Although there again, remember, we are talking about teenagers. teenagers do get snotty and do have a very different approach towards everybody. So it's being able to recognize that it may be more just there being a snotty teenager than anything else. What causes it? Well, as with anybody, there will be things like anxiety, stresses of the world. At the moment with COVID, everybody is extremely stressed, and it's been a lot of firefighting throughout this past year. But concerning teenagers, there's the extra bits concerning increased social expectations about what they should be able to do, because you're a teenager now. We should be expecting to see you do this, 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 and this. But sometimes they don't know about that. We also have the hormone changes. That's going to cause problems. Worries about what's happening to them, because suddenly everything is changing. I've got no control over my physical and social situation, because suddenly I've hit that time of my life where it all explodes. Lack of skills and understanding concerning what they can and cannot do. That bit concerning that difference between a bit of independence and still needing mum and dad. Plus everybody else looking, going, right, okay, we need to think about what we're doing. Being placed in unknown situations. One of the biggest unknown situations at the time when they're going through puberty, they're going into secondary school. And that can be a massive unknown situation that causes them problems. Even if they're in a specialist placement, you could be looking at them going into the secondary part of it, or the post 16. All those aspects. There will be changes that will occur at that point that will put them into a difficult situation, when they're also trying to understand their own bodies. They're also trying to understand all of those bits. So how can we help with that situation? Firstly, talking with someone, whether it's a parent, a friend. Sometimes it's remembering you are talking teenagers here. They don't talk to their parents. It might be that they talk to somebody else. Quite often with the work that I do, I get told sometimes far too much detail that any of the parents will get, because I'm neutral. Now I'm saying talking with. One of the difficulties you have is, even in somebody who is very verbally able, talking about their anxieties and anger is very difficult for many, and they will not be able to find the words. For some that I work with that are non-verbal, it's actually easier, because we've found other ways of doing it. I've got one person, for example, where we type on the iPad. He has no proper verbal skills. We just type, and he's able to type words. I've got some individuals that actually can sit next to their parents on the settee, and they will email each other, because what it means is you don't have to be processing conversation. A lot of the individuals I work with, if I sat down and went, right, come on, we're going to have a one-to-one conversation about your feelings, they would clam up. We do stuff while we play on Xbox. I play with dolls. We play football. We do Lego, drawing, all those sorts of things, where we talk through things. But because we've got something to distract, it just reduces the pressure that is on that person. It's also about trying to think outside the box, working out how it affects them on a physical level. Because often the physical side of it is there before the feeling side of it develops. So it's about trying to get them to understand, right, okay, this is what happens physically to me. I start feeling itchy, or I have this sensation. Right, okay, that's obviously a way to start working on methods to move away from that and look at practical situations. Try and work with the individual. One of the things that we do as professionals is we work on the individual. We tell them, we think you should do this. Actually, what we need to do is we need to get our heads out of our backsides and actually work with the individual, because most of the people I work with, whether they're verbally able, non-verbal, we will come up with ideas that will come primarily from them, not from me, but it's from them, because they understand themselves to a point. They will have different things that they will want to do, and it gives them ownership. Think about making sure everybody's aware of what's going on and how to support that person. Being consistent in the way they approach it, being consistent in things like structures, boundaries, roles, all those sorts of things. Reward systems, I mentioned that because sometimes it can work, not often, because we talk about something that often they're not controlling. And then look at ways of helping them to understand themselves and how to deal with when things start to go wrong. You know, whether that involves visuals, which you've got to remember when somebody's anxious and angry, the processing goes through the roof. And especially with a teenager, the processing going through the roof, you've got the hormones flying around, the uncertainties. We then start telling them, oh, you need to calm down, you need to calm down. No, what we need to do is we need to use visuals sometimes in that situation. Look at other ways of relaxation, other therapies. Potentially, you know, yes, there's always the conversation about medication. I'm neither for nor against. It depends upon the situation. I look at medication as being something that will help reduce the issue so that work can be done. It's not the be all and end all, because medication deals with the symptoms, not necessarily the underlying cause. So from there, go on to just the last bit for the last 15, 20 minutes, and that's the inappropriate behaviour side of it. I say inappropriate behaviour, actually, it should be sexualised behaviour, because what I'm going to talk about, not all of it is inappropriate, it's just how you do it. But one of the things to always remember, neurodiverse people, and I've been saying this before, can, will, and have been arrested for what was seen, and that's the key thing, what was seen as inappropriate sexualised behaviour. I'm not saying every single person that's neurodiverse is going to have a run-in with the criminal justice system, you know, because quite a huge proportion do not. However, you know, there will be a label that is put on them, even if it's a label in their school notes. And if we can avoid that by giving them the right support and the right education, so they understand that what they're doing is inappropriate and what the alternative is. Because often we talk about, for example, yeah, that's inappropriate, you shouldn't do that. Yeah, but what else should I do? You know, I've worked with people where one in particular, he always used to put his hand out to go and touch female members of staff. And as he's doing it, he would say that's inappropriate. Now, the staff would always turn around to me and say, well, he's saying it, so he obviously knows it's inappropriate. We discovered actually he didn't. What happened was at his previous school, whenever he put his hand out, they would say his name and they would say that's inappropriate. He was just mimicking what was happening around him. It wasn't until we sat down and went, right, okay, these are places that are appropriate, these are inappropriate, this is what it means, public and private, all those sort of things. And suddenly he was like, right, okay, now, you know, from what I can understand, yes, he still occasionally does it, but he does it more for effect because he knows full well we can wind people up, rather than actually he doesn't know what he's doing. And so that's good because it means that we can now have a conversation about what is the best way to deal with this and how, you know, how else can you get attention. So when we're looking at things such as inappropriate touching of others, there's a lot of discussion around feelings, thoughts, what good touch is, what bad touch is, you know, trying to put that all together so that they can understand what's behind some of the unacceptable behaviour. Look at things such as visuals. I mean, I've got a couple of figures where we've done it so that the hands move, so you can actually touch on the images. You can touch inappropriately without it actually being on somebody, and you can talk it through. Because you've got the issue of feelings that we'll be working on, that will be impacting upon this, it's trying to work with the individual to understand about those feelings. You know, whether or not that is verbally, whether, you know, for example, I worked with somebody who's non-verbal who was doing something similar to this, and we used Lego figures. And what happened was we interacted with the Lego figures, and we worked out from there, although he couldn't verbalize, there was a level of understanding. And so we then printed up some Lego emotion cards for them. And he was able to actually start interacting with people and starting to understand what was going on because we worked on those visuals. If something does happen, then they need to be removed from the area, but use it as a teaching method. You know, because often one of the difficulties I have is something will happen. I come along a week later and it's like, right, let's talk about what happened. They're gone, what do you mean? I've boxed that away. That's it, done. Being able to talk about it there and then if you can, and I recognise that some people find that difficult, but being able to talk about it there and then means that you can get it in action. You can start getting them to go, right, okay, why did you do that? What was going on in your head? Why were you thinking that? So, you know, it is an important thing that we need to explore, because sometimes these things often happen by accident. Sometimes it can be just an impulsivity issue. However, the knock-on effect of doing something like this can be massive. Whether it's they've got a record on their, they've got a note on their records with the school and the college, or if it's even worse, they've done something outside. And it's one of the other things to think about. The sooner you can deal with these sorts of things, the better. You know, if you've got somebody who's doing this, who is a child, and people going, okay, you know, it goes back to that thing I said at the beginning concerning what's cute as a child is not cute as an adult. You know, if you've got a child who's touching somebody's breasts and is renowned for touching somebody's breasts, actually you need to decide to stop it, because at some point that's going to carry on. I did have one lad who was severely autistic and had various other issues, but he had this tendency to when there was big-breasted women that came in his vicinity, he would lift up their tops, put his head between their breasts, and shake his head. Now that was all well and good when he was younger. I witnessed it when he was about 14. When I looked at the parents said, it's not us, we are trying to stop this. It was the extended family, because they went, oh, don't worry, it's only us. Well, when the new social worker came in, who was rather big-breasted and got the treatment, it was only at that point that the extended family realised the impact of what they were doing. And, you know, that had been going on for must have been 7 or 8 years. Try and stop somebody from doing something after that amount of time that they actually quite enjoyed and saw as a social interaction, because that's what it had always been. It'd always been a bit of play. It took ages to resolve. So you do have to be making sure that you are dealing with this as soon as possible. So from there, we get on to what some people think is my favourite subject, masturbation. As I said, I did write a chapter in the book about it. It was a bit inconvenient that they titled it Masturbation by Mark Brown. There was no practical interventions done there. The biggest things with this is, you know, it's recognizing, for example, that it is okay for people to do this. Now, I know there are some people that are like, oh God, really? But the interesting thing, and I had this once, there's sometimes you do get people go, oh no, that's dirty, we shouldn't do this. I had one instant where somebody was masturbating at school, an excessive amount. And, you know, the school were trying to work with this, and they said to me, look, can you do some work? And I sat down with him, and we were talking about masturbation, saying, oh yeah, because your bedroom, and, you know, not really anywhere else. And he said, what do you mean my bedroom? Now, his parents had not said to him he couldn't masturbate. However, nobody had actually turned around to him and said, you can masturbate, and you masturbate in your bedroom. So he didn't actually know that he could do it quite happily. That weekend, took himself off to his bedroom, and from that moment on, he stopped masturbating in school, because he now knew that he was allowed to do that. And we had to put in, of course, appropriate boundaries. Things we have to remember with it, and some of this sounds as though I'm being daft to mention these, but I've been asked by consultants to do some of this. It has to be a hands-off approach, literally. I have been asked whether I do hand-over-hand masturbation. No, I don't. 1, because it's abusive. 2, I really don't want to do that. And 3, if I teach somebody that the way that you masturbate is by having somebody's hand over you, the next time they're sat in the lounge, there is that chance that they will want to do that. Cannot provide a role model. There again, I have been asked how we can provide role models. I did have one educational psychologist from a residential school who said we've got a dad who we turned around and said to him at the review, you need to take your child home, take him upstairs, lay next to him, and show him how to masturbate. The dad was disgusted. What did you think? I told her what I thought, and I've never heard from her since. However, there are ways that you can do it, because there's things like educational videos, for example. There's cartoon videos you can use. If you've got somebody who's over the age of 18 and you use it appropriately, you can use adult material. I have had to do that. but that you have to you have to make sure it's absolutely spot on. You know, so for example, I had somebody who was from the Black community who had used some of the cartoon bits, which took him so far, but he took things very literally. So we then had to look for a clip of a Black man laying naked on a bed, masturbation from start to finish, no creams, nobody else in the room, no music, no nothing. That it had to be completely just this one thing. He was able to use it because he was over 18. He was also able to use it because we made damn sure that there was no way it could be misinterpreted. And it worked. He learned how to use it, learned how to masturbate, and he didn't need to worry. And he desperately needed to learn because he was actually touching female staff in the home that he was at, because that was the only way that he felt he could satisfy himself. So it actually meant we had to do that sort of thing because we had to make sure that he didn't get himself into trouble. If it becomes their principal activity, think about what it could be. Is it because they just haven't got the right technique? Is it a case of there's something else going on? You know, is it something like a urinary tract infection? Some medications do have issues concerning the sexual libido. So, you know, it's very much a case of exploring that. But there again, also, you might have a situation whereby your son or daughter may not show signs of wanting to masturbate. I've had parents that said to me, oh my God, they don't want to masturbate. What do we do? Don't worry. Just because they don't want to masturbate doesn't mean we have to force it on them. If they want to, they will. One of the other things to think about as well that I've not mentioned is that with masturbation, I do have some individuals that are very, very young. So, you know, 4 or 5 year olds that have shown signs of masturbation. Where we've explored it and we've looked and there's no signs of any sort of abuse, it's often sensory, because suddenly they've got this sensory feeling, you know, and somebody said to me, well, isn't there anything that you can replace it with? If you can find something that's as pleasurable to an individual as masturbation and is as easily accessible as masturbation, then go for it. What you tend to do is you tend to have to put in place the same boundaries as though that they were doing it for sexual reasons, just so when it does turn sexual, you've got those boundaries in place. Usually the frequency does decrease, often after adolescence. Sometimes it's after the first time they climax, once they finally reach that point. And concerning how we put structure to it, it is possible to do that, because what that then does is it reduces embarrassment level for everybody, but also reduces the risk of somebody potentially being abused. So the way we do that is firstly to decide upon appropriate location. I always say the bedroom, because with the bathroom, for example, you then have to start talking about differentiating between public toilets and private toilets. Private toilets in your home, private toilet in somebody else's home. So I always say the bedroom, and you know, doors closed, curtains closed, all the same sort of things that I was saying at the beginning. Think about relevant items such as tissues, bins to put them in. You know, is there anything else that you need to be thinking of? You know, is it a case of dependent upon their age? Are they, there again, I wouldn't force this on somebody. Are they old enough and want to have some sort of pornographic material? It's remembering, for example, that there are, you know, for some people, their version of porn is very different to ours. I did have one lad, I say lad, he was a man, and we were talking about masturbation, and you know, I was saying about what it was, and I was saying about materials that you can watch, and I said, you know, you could watch porn, and he said, what is porn? And I explained it. He said, oh no, not those bodies, no. He turned around to me and said, but you know the Big Bang Theory? I went, yeah. He went, cool, that Amy, her brain doesn't half turn me on. Which did explain why he used to always get an erection when he was sitting in the lounge watching Big Bang Theory. So we just turned around and said, well, that's fine, but you just remember, if you feel like doing anything like that, you take that up to your bedroom. Think about any objects, anything that they are watching whilst they are masturbating. because sometimes the emotions are linked with that. And if you've got somebody who's got issues with their emotions and their feelings, they can associate it with those the videos. They can associate it with the objects. I mean, did have somebody where the parents, they cleared the room of as many triggers as possible. Didn't realise there was this small cuddly toy in the corner. Lo and behold, that small cuddly toy, when Toys R Us were open, they were selling it. Unfortunately, the parents couldn't go into Toys R Us with their son after they went in after that, because unfortunately he saw it and it was a trigger for him to start derobing and starting wanting to masturbate, because it was an emotional link with that item. Amongst yourselves, agree what's going to be classed as a reason for them to go and how frequent. You know, is it a case of your daughter's going to have hands down her knickers and your son's going to have his penis out? Or is it hands in the genital areas? You need to decide those sorts of things. And it's quite interesting concerning, because it's very much a case, there again, it's working with the individual, even with somebody who's non-verbal. One of the ones I've mentioned about being independent, he also had a habit of his penis would always, you know, suddenly pop out. The amount of times I'd be doing a visit and I'd be sat on the settee, turn around, and there it is in your face. And we used some visuals that initially we started telling him, you know, this is right, okay, if you're going to do that, upstairs. But eventually he now knows, before he takes his penis out, well, I need to go upstairs, and he takes the picture with him. So actually, and he's completely non-verbal. So, you know, it is possible to encourage these sorts of things. And looking at that, we need to look at things such as means of indicating when they should relocate. And this is where, if you've got any children in the room, you might want them to leave. So these are two images, and I've got female versions as well. This one up here is for somebody who's quite able, and he was, you know, he needed it that much more complex because of his ability levels. This one down here, I've used this, for example, with the one I was just talking about, who went upstairs. With him, it was if he got his penis out, he would have penis, bedroom, and he knew exactly where to go. I did have somebody else who had this one, who also would get his penis out of school, but because it was inappropriate for him to masturbate at school, we had just the penis picture with a red cross through it, and at home he had this visual, and it was just shown. You know, he would quite often sit there in front of his computer and absent-mindedly be playing with himself. And if he was shown this picture and he really didn't want to, he'd put his penis away. If he wanted to, he would take himself off upstairs. You know, so it's very much a case of just giving the right things for the right person. And as I said, there are female versions of this. So just some final words before I open up for questions. And I know there's been some bits I think have popped up. Hard luck. It's going to happen whether you like it or not. You know, your child is going to have to go through this. They may be already going through this, and you're thinking, oh my God, you know, by just putting your head in the sand and thinking, no, it's not going to happen, you're going to miss out on a whole load of fun stuff. Because I can tell you, talking about all of this stuff is really fun. I love doing the sex education stuff because they will come up with various different bits and pieces. And one of the things to remember, be prepared for some weird and wonderful questions. I have lots of weird and wonderful questions that are asked to me. You know, I had one where we were with a group of individuals, and we've been talking about different relationships and legal stuff, you know, such as incest and all that, because they were at that level, and they were the ones that were providing us. Fine, okay, if you're going to say those things, I'm going to clarify. Came back the following week, and he turned around to me and said, Mark, before we go any further, I must ask this question. I said, what? He said, I've been thinking about what you said about incest. What about if I travel back in time and have sex with my mum? And what about if I clone myself and have sex with myself? Is that legal? The staff were wetting themselves laughing. But with me, it was a case you had to answer it. Luckily, I turned around and said, well, it's genetics. You know, you can't have sex with yourself because that's genetics. Mum, genetics, plus we haven't learned how to time travel yet, and we haven't cloned ourselves yet. But he needed that answered. Once he had that answered, he was like, fine, okay, we can go to the next bit. Remember, your child will need to be taught many of the social rules and will need to learn about friendships first before they learn about relationships. Never make assumptions about their knowledge, even if you know full well they have had sex education. I have plenty where my first session will be, let's talk about the names of the body parts, and the amount that have supposedly had sex education that have either not had proper sex education, or they've not taken it on board and it needed to be taught and presented in a different way. And often that different way is just being honest. Much of what is needed that you're going to be doing for when they're a teenager is just an extension of what they're already doing as a younger child. Socially, hygienically, it's just doing it that much more. And by having these conversations, by teaching about sex education and relationships and all those sort of things, what you're actually doing is you are making sure that your child, regardless of whether they're verbal or non-verbal, are less vulnerable. You know, that they understand some of the difficulties that they are going to be faced with, because there are so many things out there that they can be faced with. And, you know, just by looking at the online world, that brings up a whole nother new set of stuff. You know, I do another talk that goes on for hours just on online stuff, because of the issues that come up with it and all the problems that can occur. Okay, so let me stop sharing that. Turn that off. Right. Okay. So
thank you very much, Mark. That was really informative. I am rocking gently in the corner. I have a 4-year-old and I'm just putting this out of my mind for a really long time, but I will come back to you in about 8 years, I think. But I just wanted to touch on one of the first things you did the diagram of the spraying aerosol under the arm, and it just rings so true. If I say to my son, walk back to mummy, he walks backwards to me, and I'm like, that's exactly what he's going to do. He is going to spray it completely under his arm. So I will remember that, and I will always think of this talk whenever I put deodorant on. How would you like the questions run? Do you want people to fill them out?
I'm happy if people want to put them in the chat, question and answer, or if people want to just unmute yourself and then have a conversation.
I'm going to just stop the recording before we do that.
I was going to say stop